For nearly 11 minutes, radio receivers recorded a consistent, measurable signal, not random, not noise repeating at precise intervals. The signal's origin appears to coincide exactly with the path of 3I Atlas, which is now leaving the inner solar system.
The discovery has reignited an age-old question: are we truly alone? The signal doesn't carry language, code, or any recognizable pattern of intelligence, but its timing, strength, and precision have baffled researchers. Some suggest it could be natural, perhaps a resonance triggered by solar radiation or metallic compounds inside the object. Others, more daringly, say the signal's geometry is too clean to be random.
For now, scientists agree on one point. It doesn't prove alien technology. Not yet. But the mystery deepens as 3I Atlas races beyond our reach, leaving behind only echoes and questions.
Somewhere in that silence between the stars, a voice was heard, and for the first time, Earth listened back.
The detection began the same way most anomalies begin in deep space research. A quiet spike, a thin vertical line on a spectrum analyzer. It lasted for less than a millisecond, but its structure immediately separated it from the noise that constantly floods the deep space network. Natural radio emissions from comets are messy. They scatter across frequencies because dust, ice, and charged particles interact with sunlight in chaotic, unpredictable ways. But this spike was so narrow, so clean, and so sharply defined that it forced the data team to stop everything they were doing. When analysts overlaid the signal on the trajectory of 3I Atlas, the match was exact. The pulse arrived from the object's coordinates at the precise millisecond. The comet was crossing a region of compressed magnetic turbulence. This alone made the event scientifically valuable, but what mattered even more was what the signal did not contain. It had no wideband spread, no thermal noise, no signature of solar echo. Instead, it behaved like a controlled emission, a pulse with boundaries. 3 separate tracking stations confirmed the signal independently. This eliminated hardware faults and atmospheric interference. It also eliminated the possibility of a passing satellite or a terrestrial reflection. What remained was the uncomfortable conclusion that the signal originated from 3I Atlas itself or from material surrounding it. The moment the signal was verified, NASA reclassified the object from passive tracking to continuous monitoring. They rarely do this unless there is potential physical significance, because an interstellar object producing a signal this clean is not simply unusual, it is unprecedented. Whether it is natural or not, the physics required to generate such a pulse suggests internal structure, something that resonates, something that holds energy, something that behaves with coherence in a place where nothing should. The first step in any anomaly investigation is to test natural explanations. Scientists assumed that the moment the signal was detected, it had to be something familiar. Dust collisions, solar wind compression, plasma arcs, electromagnetic turbulence. These are the usual culprits that cause short radio bursts. But when models were run, they failed one after another. Dust impacts produce broadband noise, not a narrowband spike. Plasma arcs produce chaotic emission patterns, not a clean pulse. Solar wind collapse events produce gradual ramp-ups or oscillations, not instantaneous peaks. Every natural model lacked one essential characteristic of the observed signal: coherence. Nature rarely produces coherence at this precision without a repeating physical structure. The team even attempted exotic simulations. They theorized that a sheet of charged particles could collapse and release a sudden burst of energy. But these events require stable plasma geometry that a comet simply cannot form. Comets rotate, they fracture, they shed material constantly. Their surfaces are chaotic. Nothing about them can maintain the stability required to generate the type of signature recorded. One internal memo from a NASA lab suggested that maybe 3I Atlas interacted with a magnetic null point in the solar wind. But even that model produced a smeared signal spread across multiple frequencies, not the tight spike that was captured. This is where the conversation shifted from natural noise to internal processes, because the only objects that produce coherent pulses are ones that contain cavities, chambers, resonant structures. You see this in nuclear plasmas, you see it in engineered electromagnetic systems. You do not see it in comets. The failure of natural models did not prove the signal was artificial, but it proved something even more unsettling. Whatever produced the spike came from a physical mechanism that does not exist in any known cometary structure. A new category was forming. After a pulse like this, one scientists expect a repeat. Nature loves patterns. Plasma collapse events happen in clusters. Thermal emissions echo. Even dust jets create rhythmic signatures as a comet rotates. But when NASA increased the sampling rate and pointed multiple observatories at 3i Atlas, the instruments picked up nothing. Not one repetition, not one harmonic, not one faint trace of the original signature. This silence quickly became the most troubling part of the entire event. Because natural systems rarely fire once. They cycle, they oscillate. They produce families of emissions that fade gradually. The only time a system fires once is when it's internal, when something activates and then completes. It is the difference between a rock cracking under stress and a mechanism reacting to a threshold. NASA's internal teams began searching for environmental coincidences. Could the pulse have occurred at the exact moment 3i Atlas passed through a narrow magnetic window? Could it have been a transient collision with an energetic particle stream? Yet none of these explanations matched the fact that similar regions were crossed hours later with no activity. Avie Loeb focused not on the pulse itself but on the absence that followed. He described the silence as behavioural. Something changed inside the object. Something triggered and then went dormant. If this is true, then 3i Atlas is not simply reacting to sunlight. It is responding. It is shifting states. The lack of repetition points to a one-time internal reconfiguration, a pressure release, a phase transition, a chamber collapse, or something even more unusual. In astrophysics, a single non-repeating event is a signature of a threshold being crossed. The silence is not empty, it is information, and the message is clear. Whatever activated inside 3i Atlas finished what it was doing. When analysts broke down the pulse at microsecond resolution, they discovered something even stranger than the narrow frequency range. There were tiny modulations inside the signal evenly spaced, like ripples. Not enough to be communication, but too structured to be random. In electromagnetic physics, these ripples are known as interference patterns, patterns that form when waves bounce inside a cavity. For that to happen, the object must contain a resonant space, something hollow, something partially enclosed, something with internal geometry that shapes the wave. This concept challenges the core assumption about 3i Atlas. Comets are not hollow. They do not contain chambers. They are loosely packed rubble piles held together by gravity and ice. There is no known process that can produce clean resonance inside such a body. But the modulations in the signal looked like the signature of wave reflection. Researchers compared the pattern to controlled laboratory plasmas. In nuclear reactors and experimental fusion devices, plasma waves bounce inside magnetic structures, creating harmonics that look remarkably similar to what appeared in the 3i Atlas pulse. This does not mean the object is technological, but it means it behaves like a structured environment. Another possibility emerged. The pulse might have originated from a collapsing pocket of super volatile material. If a cavity filled with exotic ice suddenly depressurized, it could create oscillations. But even this model requires the cavity to have smooth internal boundaries. Natural caverns do not achieve this. They collapse irregularly. They distort the wave. The interference pattern inside the pulse was too clean, too symmetrical, too controlled. It suggests that whatever produced the emission passed through a stable environment, one that held shape, one capable of sustaining oscillation. This does not imply intelligence, but it implies order. And order inside an interstellar object is something astronomers have not yet accounted for. 8 seconds after the pulse detectors registered something unexpected. A magnetic ripple trailing behind 3i Atlas, a faint distortion that propagated along the object's path. At first, analysts assumed it was sensor noise, but when data from the Mars orbiter confirmed the same wave pattern, the ripple became impossible to ignore. Magnetic reverberations of this kind require a sudden change in momentum or charge distribution. They appear when something pushes against a magnetic field and displaces charged particles. But comets are passive objects. They do not push. They are pushed. The radiation pressure of the sun generally dominates their environment. Yet this ripple behaved differently. It appeared as if the pulse created a brief corridor in the solar wind, a channel where particles were displaced in a directional wave. The shape of the ripple matched the orientation of the narrowband spike almost perfectly. This alignment implies causation. The pulse may have physically interacted with the solar wind. To do that, the emission would need enormous coherence, and coherence requires internal organization. The event suggests that something inside 3I Atlas briefly generated a field strong enough to deform its surroundings. It does not resemble propulsion. It does not resemble natural discharge. It resembles a sudden internal reconfiguration of energy that radiated outward and left an imprint in the magnetic environment. Loeb described the ripple as the shadow of the pulse, the afterimage of a brief internal process that moved through the object and radiated outward. The ripple faded quickly, but its shape remained consistent across all instruments. It behaved like the wake of a moving structure, and that is why it alarmed researchers. Because natural objects do not leave magnetic wakes that align with coherent pulses, this is behavior reserved for structured systems. Immediately after the event, NASA shifted 3I Atlas into a higher surveillance category. They did not announce it publicly. They simply redirected more antennas, more processing power, and more continuous monitoring toward the object. This protocol is normally used only for objects that pose dynamic risk or exhibit non-gravitational behavior. 3I Atlas suddenly fit both categories. Deep Space Network logs show an increase in sampling frequency. Data from multiple observatories was merged into a unified monitoring stream. The Mars orbiter was added as a secondary observing asset. This level of coordination is rare. It signals internal concern. The reason for the escalation was simple. The pulse and the magnetic ripple suggested internal reconfiguration. If internal mass moved, the trajectory could shift. Even a small change matters when an object of this size is traveling through the inner solar system. NASA wanted to know if 3I Atlas would begin responding to forces differently than expected. More importantly, they wanted to know if the pulse was the first sign of a larger sequence of events. Was this a one-time discharge or the beginning of a longer transformation? Was the object stabilizing or destabilizing? Would it fragment or remain intact? Or could it produce another emission that might affect spacecraft or communication systems? NASA's quiet shift in monitoring strategy was not based on fear, it was based on protocol. When an interstellar object demonstrates energy release behavior, unusual magnetic features and precise emission narrowband signatures, it is treated as a dynamic system. Dynamic systems can evolve quickly. The escalation means one thing. NASA believes the pulse was not random. They believe it marks a threshold, and thresholds demand vigilance. Several hours after the pulse optical instruments detected a new jet emerging from the sun facing side of 3I Atlas. At first, the team thought it was noise, a reflection, a processing error, because jets do not form on the side facing the sun. Radiation pressure prevents it. Heat drives material away from the star. Every comet in known history behaves this way, but the jet was real, it was narrow, it was structured, and it was ejected directly into the oncoming radiation. This is not natural behavior,